Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second here. Okay, and good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Spencer Ruckty. I'm the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. On behalf of the store, I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Katie Kitamura and Alexandra Kleeman, who are both here to talk about Katie's new book, Intimacies. Through virtual events like tonight's, Third Place Books is very fortunate to continue connecting readers with authors in an intimate setting. We sorely miss having authors in our stores, but at the same time, we're so thankful to you, or we're so thankful to have this platform that brings our growing event series to you, into your homes all across the world. Thank you again for tuning in and for supporting independent bookstores. Before we begin, I have a few events I'd like to plug from our forthcoming events calendar. On Wednesday, we have Matthew Spector for his new collection, Always Crashing in the Same Car. We have Mona Awad in conversation with Heather O'Neill on August 5th, where they'll be discussing Mona's Shakespearean novel, All's Well, which has been receiving rave reviews from our staff. And I am personally excited about our virtual event with the literary horror sci-fi multi-hyphenate icon and writer Brian Evanson for his short story collection, The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, which will be in conversation with Lincoln Michelle on August 11th. You can find our full events calendar on our website at thirdplacebooks.com, where I would also like to encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter. In a couple minutes in the Zoom chat below, I will be sharing a link to purchase tonight's featured book, Intimacies. If you're in the Seattle area, you can order Intimacies online and pick up in the store, or just swing by any one of our locations at Lake Forest Park, Ravenna, or Seward Park to get your copy. We're happily open to the public and we ship all across the country. During tonight's events, I'd also like to remind you that the chat window at the bottom of your screen is open, and I definitely encourage you to use it respectfully. Tonight, we will also have some time for your questions. So if you have questions for our authors this evening, please submit those in the Q&A window below, which is separate from the chat window at the bottom of your screen. We also are happy to offer closed captioning for those who are interested. Just hit the live transcript button at the bottom of your window to turn this feature on and off. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and understanding. Overall, a huge thank you to all of you who have stuck with us during this virtual era. It's strictly because of you that this author series is even possible. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers. Katie Kitamura's Intimacies has already received myriad rave reviews from New York Times, Washington Post, and more, as well as a selection as one of Barack Obama's favorite summer reads. Her new novel is an electrifying story about a woman caught between many truths. Talk to booksellers and critics alike, and I have a feeling they'll agree with Third Place Books' own Wes Minter, who describes Kitamura as one of the boldest, most mysterious writers we have. Kitamura's last novel, A Separation, was a New York Times notable book and named a Best Book of the Year by over a dozen publications, translated into 16 languages, and is currently being adapted for film. Her two previous novels, Gone to the Forest and The Long Shot, were both finalists for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award. She is joined tonight in conversation by Alexandra Kleeman, the author of Intimations and the novel You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine, which another one of our booksellers, Mark at our Ravenna store, had high praise for when it was released, calling it clinical and yet alluring. You may not have read anything like this before. Kleeman's work has been published in the New Yorker, the Paris Review, Harper's, Tin House, and elsewhere. And this is a particularly exciting evening to be hosting Alexandra Kleeman because her new book, Something New Under the Sun, releases in about 5 hours in Pacific time, or 2 hours if you're on the East Coast. I'm going to be sharing more information about that book and where you can get it in the chat below. But there's an incredible review of it in the LA Times today that I encourage you to check out that calls it muscular, brilliant, bonkers, an incredibly upsetting portrait of not only who we are, but what we may yet become. So, of course, we are all here tonight to celebrate the release of Katie Kitamura's Intimacies. So many writers that I personally admire love this book, such as Catherine Lacey in the New York Times Book Review, who says that Kitamura's work contains a keen understanding of human behavior, one that reaches far beyond the pages of this brief and arresting book. And of course, there's also Wes Minter at Third Place Books, who I sincerely hope is watching right now, who calls Intimacies 200-odd pages of sharp ideas and moral jostling, full of characters that make even the ground under your feet feel unreliable. Without further ado, thank you for taking time out of your busy evenings to be with us. Let's please welcome Katie Kitamura and Alexandra Kleeman. The virtual stage is yours.
Spencer, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And I have to thank Wes as well, who I haven't met and whose face I can't see, but I'm truly so grateful for his support. And as you said, I'm so excited to be here with Alex tonight because her book is out in, 1 hour and 15 minutes on the East Coast where I am, and it is here. I have it. It is absolutely brilliant, original, stunning, all the adjectives at my disposal. Those were not the best ones, but those I have many, many. So Alex, thank you so much for being here. And I'm so happy to see your face. I think I'm going to read for a few minutes from Intimacies, and then I think Alex and I will chat for a little bit, and then I'm going to detour the conversation to make her talk to me a bit about something new under the sun, and then I think we'll wrap up with some questions if there are any. So Intimacies is about a interpreter who moves to The Hague in the Netherlands to take a job working at a war crimes tribunal. This section that I'm going to read is a little bit about what interpretation, kind of what the ethical questions of interpretation might be. And it is primarily a story that's being told to her by a colleague. And I think that's all you need to know. As I sat down at my desk, I recalled an anecdote she had told me not long after I arrived at the court. It was a story I thought of often. Amina had been tasked with interpreting for the accused, working in Swahili, and was briefly the only interpreter on the team with adequate fluency to perform the task. Her booth partner did not have a strong grasp on the language and said in private that her mind had drifted during the lengthy sessions. She listened to the originating English and French, less closely to Amina's interpretation. But Amina herself was under considerable pressure. She was negotiating marathon sessions that were far longer than standard. She sat in the mezzanine level booth, the accused positioned directly below her in the courtroom. He was still a young man, a former militia leader, wearing an expensive suit and slouched in an ergonomically designed office chair. He was on trial for hideous crimes, and yet he simply looked as he sat, sullen and perhaps a little bored. Of course, the accused are often in suits and in office chairs, but the difference lay in the fact that at the court, the accused were not merely dressed up for the occasion, but were men who had long worn the mantle of authority conveyed by a suit or uniform, men who were accustomed to its power. And they had a kind of magnetism, in part innate and in part heightened by the circumstances. The accused had an aura when they were brought to The Hague. We had heard a great deal about these men, and they were almost always men. We had seen photographs and video footage, and when they finally appeared in the court, they were the stars of the show. There was no other way of putting it. The situation staged their charisma. In the case of this particular man, he was not only young and undeniably handsome, but he had a dazzling air of command. Even without the aid of the courtroom, it was easy to see why and how so many people had obeyed his orders. But it was not even this, Amina explained. It was the intimacy of the interpretation. She was interpreting for one man and one man alone, and when she spoke into the microphone, she was speaking to him. Of course, she had known when she accepted the post in The Hague that the substance of the court would be darker than the United Nations, where she had previously been working. After all, the court concerned itself exclusively with genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. But she had not expected this kind of proximity. Although she was never face to face with the accused and was always safely ensconced behind the glass-fronted interpreter's booth, she was constantly aware that she and the accused were the only two people in the courtroom who understood the language she was speaking. Over the course of these first sessions, Amina grew increasingly uneasy. The case involved a great deal of testimony regarding terrible atrocity, and hour by hour, she carried this testimony from one language into another. She found herself on occasion struggling to control the tremor in her voice. She felt herself becoming entirely too emotional. But then, as quickly as the second day, and for reasons she did not fully understand, a certain hardness overtook her. She discovered a new and acerbic tone, not exactly neutral, perhaps even reproachful. At one point, she relayed the details of an embezzlement scheme, something that was morally questionable but a trifle compared to the other charges against the man. She found herself using a voice of cold disapproval. as if she were a wife, scolding her husband for some small domestic failing, neglecting to do the dishes, for example, rather than addressing his rampant infidelity or the fact that he had gambled away their life savings. At that moment, to her surprise, she saw the accused turn his head and look up in the direction of the interpreters. Until this point, he had sat almost entirely still, staring straight ahead, as if the proceedings had nothing to do with him, as if the entire matter was beneath him, although the result, Amina thought, was not the appearance of dignity. Rather, he looked like a sulky teenager being reprimanded for some infraction for which he refused to repent. There were perhaps half a dozen interpreters seated in the mezzanine level booths. It was unlikely that he would know which one of them was his. She had never before noted him observing them. She forced herself to keep her voice steady and focus on the job at hand. The last thing she wanted to do was get distracted. Nonetheless, she was unable to keep from surreptitiously watching the accused as his gaze swept the glass-fronted booths. Perhaps feeling her eyes upon him, he suddenly stopped and looked directly at her, turning in his chair in order to do so. Amina couldn't help it. She stumbled over her words, apologized, nearly lost the thread of what was being said. He continued to stare at her, a grim expression of satisfaction settling into his handsome face, perhaps because he had succeeded in intimidating her, in causing her to falter. She felt at once, even through the glass wall dividing them, the totality of the man's will. I'm going to stop there.
I'm so glad that you read that passage. I've been spending all summer, I think, trying to articulate and re-articulate to people why I love this book so much. And they've been trying to articulate and re-articulate it to me. And one thing I think is this incredible clarity and precision that you bring to things that are so knotted and so subtle that an observer too coming into, the Hague, looking up at the interpreters, could miss all of the emotions that are passing back and forth between the figures. So you delineate the knot with such clarity, and then you don't try to untie it and make it simpler in any way. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Alex.
I'm a very big fan of this book, and so when I had the opportunity to talk to you about it, I just jumped. One thing I wanted to ask you about, because I was curious while reading it, is about this theme of intimacy. Just starting with the title, it's a word which at first feels sort of self-apparent because we've all had intimacy, we've had different kinds of intimacies, but as soon as you start looking at the word more, it refracts and it becomes less clear what you're thinking about, I think. My father has a definition for intimacy that's something like it can be measured in how long you can sit with a person and not feel the need to talk. And this is not my definition at all, but I think it shows how many different versions there are. And I'm wondering how you might define it and how the concept and all of its haziness and all of its multitudinous guided your work when writing this book.
Yeah, Alex, thank you so much for those words, which mean such a lot to me. As you know, I'm also just the biggest fan of your work. And I know our work is in a lot of ways very different on the page, but at the same time, I feel like I don't know if it's just the kinship of loving your work because I feel so close to the writers I love. But anyway, I do feel like there are maybe points of similarity. In terms of the title, I mean, how would I define intimacy? I felt like it was almost like a presence that you can't avoid. And I think it was, I mean, I think we're kind of, we're taught to think of intimacy and I think empathy as well as inherently a kind of positive thing, something that we seek out in our relationships. And, we want to be intimate with our partners or with our friends. We're endlessly trying to teach our children to be empathetic, but I actually think both of those things are very, very double-sided. And when the title was put in place after the draft was done, but when I read through the book, I realized that there are so many cases where there was something that was being imposed on the narrator that she didn't necessarily want, whether it's the kind of haunting, she's haunted by a lot of different characters in this book, by the presence of her new romantic partner, by his ex-wife, she's forced into closeness with one of the men who is standing trial at this war crimes tribunal. And through that process, she begins to feel a kind of empathy for him that really troubles her and that makes her very, very uncomfortable. And it's almost like she's being occupied in some ways. So I think for me, when I was thinking about these, it had a lot to do with the idea of people, almost like your body being occupied in some way or taken over. And there are so many instances of sexual harassment and intimidation in the novel, which I kind of realized after I wrote it. And, I was writing it kind of during the kind of height, I suppose, of the Me Too era. But nonetheless, I think there was something about the fact that sexual harassment is adjacent to this idea of unwanted intimacy, obviously. And I guess ultimately I was also interested in thinking about how intimacy is linked to power, because the novel is very tied up in the idea of power, who has power and who doesn't have power, and how it's exerted. And I think intimacy, seduction, empathy, those are all things that can be exploited to assert power over somebody. That's a kind of long-winded, very wandering around.
I mean, that's a fantastic answer. And it also calls me back to that line in the passage that you read, where Amina is experiencing the intimacy of the interpretation. Yeah. Like, we tend to think that behaving in a professional capacity shouldn't be intimate at all. And by contrast, like, behaving in a personal capacity should always yes. sort of be intimate and always be positive. But there's this way in which language or relation opens this channel that can be co-opted, or can also force you into a association that you didn't accept with another person.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that's really kind of the key for me. What I really wanted to write about in the book was the way that language, even bureaucratic language and official language, can be kind of co-opted and can have a kind of vibration that creates links where you don't necessarily want links. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that the narrator experiences is that, she at least I think in the beginning of the book, she kind of thinks of herself as an almost neutral channel for language. Like, she thinks of language passing through her in some way. And I think she at one point describes herself as a kind of consciousness-free zone, or purely an instrument of the court. And that's really, I think, a fantasy. I think that idea of this perfect neutrality, of being untouched by the language that you speak, is really a fantasy. And I think one of the things that she has to come to realize over the course of the novel is that she is, of course, very much touched by the language she's speaking, even if she's not the person who's authoring it. And mm-hmm. that by speaking the language of, say, the institution, you become part of the institution. And I think I think it's so easy to disavow the language that we use, and just to say that it's a currency of, it's what everybody's saying. But I think, obviously as writers, we think very particularly about language and the choices that we're making when we write. And I mean, I guess the other thing I'll say is that the kind of kernel of the book really came to me when I was listening to Charles Taylor speaking on the radio, and he was speaking in his own defense in his own trial at the Hague. And he is, a very compelling speaker. And even as you sense the monstrosity of his ego and of the things that you've done, you can feel him manipulating rhetoric and language and making it persuasive and making it seductive. And all of that, I think, for a writer is very disturbing, because that's not unlike that's not unrelated to what we do on the page. Obviously, by the way you kind of shape your sentences is there's the content, and then there's also the way you're delivering it, and they're two delivery mechanisms in a way for what you're saying in a book. So those kinds of things were definitely at the forefront of my mind.
Yeah, I mean, when you're writing, you're aiming to touch the reader, but to what extent is touching them neutral, and to what extent is it sort of manipulation? And if it's a manipulation, you're welcome. Yes.
No, that is really true. And I think it's also, I mean, I don't know about you, and because I think both of us, particularly in your new novel, but kind of play around with ideas of genre and what genre expectations are. And even though I think, you know, I probably sadly for my readers, but I never deliver, I don't think, on the genre expectation, in part because, you know, I actually, in some ways, I feel like the kind of structure of say a mystery or a thriller can feel like a manipulation, but of course, even using the genre setup and then not delivering it is a kind of manipulation. So it's an interesting field to try to negotiate. But yes, go ahead.
Deliver. I mean, you know, I was talking with a bookseller today, and we both had the experience of picking up this book and starting to read it, you know, toward the end of the night and not being able to stop, even when it's far past time to go to sleep. Like, there's such a tautness and attention to this book, and I think that it's especially amazing that you create that when it contains few of the sort of expected genre actions and happenings that we might be primed to see. Like, I feel like you're probably haunted a little bit by the other work happening in the interpretive space, which is like The Interpreter with Nicole Kidman film.
Yes.
Probably bring up to you all the time. And that's a work that, you know, has assassinations and every other thing that you might expect in terms of a plot twist. Here, it feels like the tension comes in part not from the narrator making decisions that radically shift the frame of the story, but that we can viscerally feel the tension and effort that it takes for her not to act and not to disrupt it, almost like to pull back in her interpretation and not let disappointment or anger or fear seep through into her intimidation or into her interpretation, and thereby show that she is weak or she is affected by this man.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I mean, thank you so much for saying that, and I'm relieved to feel like there is, I mean, I feel like what I want to try to, or certainly what I've done with this novel and also with my last one, which is called A Separation, was to kind of start with something that almost had a mystery premise to it, and then to kind of see if it was possible to turn the tension inward into the kind of consciousness or the mind of the narrator rather than externalize it into plot, if that makes sense. And so I think in a lot of ways, I always felt like the tension in the novel would have to come from very small internal shifts within the mind of the character rather than through plot events. But I mean, I think one thing that I always wanted to try to, I found first person very difficult for a very long time, and I never wrote in it, and I found it uncomfortable. And I mean, there were kind of personal reasons for that. I don't know. I think I was kind of worried that there would be a certain amount of assumptions. I couldn't articulate the distance between me as a writer and the first person, which now sounds very kind of juvenile and kind of young in my writing, but that was kind of how I felt about it for a while. And for me, the first person cracked open when I felt like I could use it to convey uncertainty and doubt and destabilization. So whereas I think, you know, many of the first person narrators that I love are kind of authoritative and are, you know, manipulating you very overtly and telling you a particular kind of story. And I think, but for me, the first person became plausible and possible when I felt like I could use it to constantly destabilize the narration. And so, you know, often, as you say, she's caught in a kind of, there's so many layers of hypothesizing and interpretation to the way she sees the world. And like very rarely will she look at somebody and say, this is what they are. It's usually like 2, 3. She's constantly reassessing her sense of both the situation and the people she's around. And like at one point she meets this kind of, you know, probably I would say unsympathetic character who's a defense lawyer, but she meets him in the capacity of a party where he's just a kind of slightly salacious guy who she's trying to get away with. And then later she sees him in the context of the court where she's working, and she kind of suddenly thinks, if I'd seen him in this context first, I would have seen him as an entirely different person. I probably would have taken him very seriously. I might have started a relationship with him. She just kind of can see this alternative version of events. And so I think that uncertainty is where a lot of the tension, for me at least when I'm writing, really lies. And then I think in this particular novel, rather than having that spin out into a kind of sense of the world closing in and a kind of sense of paralysis, I wanted to see if I could make that a kind of productive thing that would open up the book. And so at the very end of the book, I kind of discovered what you were talking about when you said there's a kind of withholding of judgment. And I think that's what allows her to continue in the relationship that she has been in for the novel, is precisely that withholding of judgment, and that kind of understanding that what you think of a person is fluid and constantly changing.
It's such an interesting inversion of this idea we usually have, that unreliable narrators create uncertainty and reliable narrators create certainty. She is so accurate and so precise in how she sees and tells, but it only makes you more aware of how much is just not visible or recoverable.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I always wanted that to be, I wanted her to experience the world in fragments rather than in totalities. I think in part because that's really very much what it's felt like for me, kind of, you know, in the last 4 or 5 years, especially, but just in general, I rarely feel myself to be the person with the entire narrative. I feel myself to be the person with little tiny fragments and slivers, and from which I try to kind of understand what is happening around me and what my place in relation to that might be. So, you know, she's somebody who's adjacent to power, but not ever in a position of power. She's somebody who speaks the language of power, but doesn't offer that language. And she often has, you know, whether it's at her work in the court or with her partner, she only really has a little bit of the information, and she's constantly trying to fill in the rest of it with conjecture and with imagination. And that, I think, is a kind of slightly perilous place for her to be.
Perilous place for anyone. But actually, because you brought up a separation, I was wondering if you might be willing to speak just a bit about how sort of the power of narrative or the power of language operates differently in that book than in this one. Like in that book, it feels more like a mystery, that there's the possibility that recovering pieces of this narrative will help illuminate like her own life story, what it meant, what the things she was going through with her husband actually were. And in this book, it feels more like the speech act or something, like this really interesting situation you create where the man she's in a relationship with, who is married but estranged, he asks her to live with him while he goes and breaks things off with his ex-wife once and for all, gets the divorce paper signed, and then she just doesn't hear from him for months, and yet she can't seem to end the relationship without some sort of a communication. Like without language, you can't sever or form a relationship. You're just sort of stuck there. Is this a different version of the power of language?
It's so funny that you said that, because it really isn't until you said it that I realized there's a very similar thing in a separation where she is the one who is going to separate from her partner in Greece. She's looking for him to divorce him, and then he you know, to spoil the plot, but I love plot spoilers in general, you know, he's dead. He's found dead in the middle of the book, and then that closure, she never is able to achieve that closure. And I think when I was writing Intimacies, you know, there are real, obviously, similarities between the two novels. I think the kind of basic, you know, they're both first-person narrators. They both are kind of professionals in language. In A Separation, she's a translator, and in Intimacy, she's an interpreter. They're both people who are, you know, speaking from a kind of place on the sidelines. They're very much observers of the action. And so I think I very much felt that I had to see if I could use that same kind of palette, but create something that felt sufficiently different from the last book. And I think in a lot of ways, they almost move in opposite directions. I think A Separation starts with somebody who thinks she understands the narrative very clearly, and then that expectation is overturned and she's kind of forced to reevaluate what she understood of her relationship in the past. And I think Intimacies moves with somebody who begins with somebody who very much doesn't have a narrative or understanding of her play. She's very adrift. And then over the course of the novel, very slowly, things start to maybe fall in place. And I think one of the things that, and I hope it isn't too on the nose, but one of the kind of actions that she takes is that she, stops working in the court and she stops speaking for other people. And in the final moments of the novel, it kind of speaks for herself, and she kind of has to learn to, as you say, she kind of has to claim that speech act in order to make that transition. And I think in A Separation, it's very much the opposite. I think she's kind of lost all control of the narrative, and the narrative is controlling her in a lot of ways. The kind of story that she's told becomes the dominant story. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I knew I wanted the novel to end on a piece of speech. It felt important to me that it was actually dialogue and that she was speaking very much for herself, which was something that she hasn't been able to do for the majority of the novel.
And not to plot spoiler, because I don't think this is plot, but for those of you who've read it or who haven't read it yet, there's this amazing moment of hope that you evoke at the end there. And I think like these emotions that we do experience regularly, but that are so complex and so sort of uncommon too in literature. I think like trust, hope, and this really careful, well-informed optimism. There's something at the end of this book that's really special and makes it emotionally very different from where A Separation ends up.
Yeah, I mean, I was really, I remember I was kind of reaching the final stages of the novel, and I thought, I know how to write that ending where everything feels quite bleak and you have a woman alone. And I thought, I really don't want to repeat that. I want to try to do something new, and I want to try to do something that I don't know how to do, which is, I don't think I'm known for my happy endings. So I had a very clear feeling in mind, which is, I mean, it sounds ridiculous to say it, but I will say it is that the Chekhov's short story, Lady with a Lapdog, and how at the end of that story, suddenly, I always just think of it like a door opening on the story. And there are things possible for these characters that you hadn't thought was possible for the majority of the reading of it. And I think I wanted to see if I could, end the novel so that it feels like it's opening up instead of closing down. It was like very, very simple, kind of just the feeling of something expansive rather than closing down. But I want to ask you, Alex, before we run out of time, a few questions about your novel, which is out tomorrow. But can I just quickly ask? Is that okay? Do you mind?
Yeah.
I mean, I loved the novel so much, which is set in a very near future California, and I think it's in a lot of ways it's the most. Is it fair to say it's kind of the most realist of your works to date? But I found myself really feeling that the uncanny, uncomfortable power of the novel is in the fact that it's nestled so closely to our own reality. And the fact that at times when you're reading it, you think this is maybe a decade in the future, maybe a year in the future. At some points you think it's happening right now. And I just wonder, like, when you were writing it, how did you feel yourself relating to that realism and also to the kind of temporal positioning of the story? Because I think that closeness is what makes it kind of so terrifying, even as it's a tremendous joy to read.
That's such a great question, Katie. And I think, one of the interesting things about trying to write in the near future, which I'm not sure is all anyone should necessarily pursue, is that day by day, you feel like the distance between that future that you're projecting off is shrinking and growing. Like, I did finish my draft last summer when 3 of the biggest wildfires in Colorado history were burning like some number of miles away. And you think like, am I writing the present or am I writing the future that scientists are projecting are coming? But in fact, like you're writing the new normal, because this year is the same. It's been so eerie to me to have experienced 2 years in a row, when I haven't had it in the years previous, of not being able to see the mountains, which are normally the marker. You navigate by them, you see where you are and where you're headed just by recognizing the different faces of the range alongside you. So, you know, just talking about how it is a bit more realist, I think part of the reason I shied away from using a real place or really recognizable marked things in my fiction was because I felt that these things like Los Angeles, for example, or the areas around it carry their own affect. I couldn't really mold them. I couldn't be free to retell them or remake them. But I think I'm feeling now that there's a much deeper strangeness beneath all the normal affects associated with the things around us. And we're just going to see that strangeness take on more and more agency and more life in the years to come, or this summer, or next
tomorrow, or right now. I mean, you know, I spoke a little bit earlier about your use of genre, which is a kind of incredible, almost swirling, like it's like a genre swirl that you do in this novel. And it's one of the things that I love is watching different genres almost cannibalize each other as they kind of claim their space in the book. It's such a kind of virtuosic performance. But I also wondered if that's part of how you're playing with the kind of received language and associations of this particular place and landscape. You know, you open with this incredibly funny, and I want to know if it was as fun for you to write as it was for me to read, kind of the washed up novelist turning up in LA for his possible film adaptation. But then, you know, it kind of moves, there's a kind of noir element, almost like a kind of rewiring of Chinatown in terms of the kind of control of water in Los Angeles. And I guess I just wondered, you know, what that was like, and how you controlled the shift from genre to genre.
You know, like I think that this question intersects also with what I love so much about your novel, like how it skirts the line between genre tensions and genre affects, and then directs your expectation in a sort of more interesting and philosophical direction as well. Like it makes use of what we know about genre to sort of question our what we're programmed to expect from the story there. Mm-hmm. So I think like we can articulate what we expect a genre story is going to do, but we're much less handy at articulating what a realistic story is supposed to do. And yet we do have all of these expectations and ideas about what is realistic, what is believable, how people act, how they don't act, and what kind of things can happen, you know. So I think that more than trying to write a straight science fiction novel, even though there's science fiction elements, if I aim right at something like that, I'll probably get scared and miss it, right? Yeah. But being in an intergenre space, I think, makes you as the reader and also you as the writer think constantly about what sort of grooves am I following? What unquestioned sort of patterns do I think I'm going to reenact? And what does it mean? What am I saying about the way the world works if I fall into that groove or if I don't? You know, and
I mean, no, I was just going to say, I think that's one of the reasons why it's really such a, there's a tremendous amount of energy in the book as you read it, is I think because it kind of will set up the genre expectation, but then it doesn't follow it and it goes in another direction. And so you are really made to be aware of, you know, there's a kind of general kind of climate change related complacency that I think really the novel addresses very, very directly, but you also become aware of the assumptions you make as a reader, I think, you know, which is why it's kind of, it has this incredible energy as you read it.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. And
I don't know if we're supposed to pivot to audience. Spencer, can I ask Alex one last question?
Yeah.
There is the kind of you know, the almost the jewel in the crown of the novel is this invention of this synthetic water, which is WAT-R water, and then the kind of black market for actual water, and you kind of develop this so beautifully. Was a starting point for the novel the idea of water and synthetic water and what seems all too plausible to follow in California? It was.
Yeah, like in researching this book, one thing I did was I spent some time with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. I was told to some experts on California water supply there, and they were brilliant people. They have really interesting things going on with satellite monitoring of crops and water use by crops, and being able to see respiration sort of at this incredible voxel level from way up in the sky. But when I asked about scarcity, you know, someone said to me, well, if we run out, we're just going to build a pipe to one of the Great Lakes, so we will be fine. And I think like that quick solution, the substitution, the thing that seems sort of absurd at first glance, but then becomes a real possibility, is part of the logic of our time. I think it's not all that far off. And so I really wanted to explore what a synthetic water might look like. And especially, you know, I think our bodies react viscerally to water. We know the taste of good water. We know when something's a little bit off, old pipes, or you can recognize, you know, the taste of water from the place that you're from versus traveling, you drink from the tap. And to try to evoke that wrongness was one of the little challenges that I wanted to pose to myself. The same way that, you know, in my first novel, I was really interested in thinking about how I could make eating, this thing we do just eat reflexively, even without much thinking about it, feel like this incredible physiological choreography.
I love that. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Katie. And we have questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm here to read off some questions on behalf of the audience. We have our first question from Joseph, who asked Katie, why did you choose to leave your narrator unnamed?
Thank you for that question. I mean, it's funny, sometimes people ask me if I know the name of my narrator, and I know a lot of things about her, but I absolutely do not know her name. But I think one of the reasons, you know, the narrator is unnamed in Intimacies and also in A Separation, I think one of the reasons is because they're both people who kind of don't occupy a solid place in the social structure. So in A Separation, the narrator is technically separated from her partner, but still kind of married to him, and everybody thinks they're still together. And so she's kind of playing out a part that isn't actually who she is or what she's experiencing. And so she doesn't have the kind of, she's in an in-between place. She doesn't have the kind of symbolic security of either being married or separated. And similarly in Intimacy, she's kind of, to use that fashionable phrase, she's speaking from a liminal space, but she is a kind of in-between character. She's not really sure if she's just visiting. She's not really sure if she's going to stay. That sense of where she's from is quite fraught for her. So I think leaving these characters unnamed for me underlines or reinforces the fact that they don't have a fixed place or secure place within a larger social system that some of the people around them do have. So a lot of the kind of, particularly the Dutch characters in the novel have, they have these fully articulated names, and they have these very secure social positions, and they have financial security, and they speak from a place of security, which is almost the opposite of the narrator, who speaks from a position of relative precarity, and who doesn't, she doesn't know if her job is going to extend, she doesn't understand what's happening in her relationship. And so that's kind of why they're unnamed. But I don't know how much longer I can carry on doing it. I think names may have to appear at some point.
Yeah. I'm sure it makes for a great time reviewing the book. There were sort of along those lines, actually, we have another question from an anonymous attendee who asks, you mentioned avoiding writing in the first person prior to this book, or being unable to differentiate yourself from the first person. Can you speak about one or two first person narrators that you admire?
I mean, I did a graduate degree on Nabokov, who is one of the great first person narrators, from kind of Pale Fire in the footnotes to obviously Lolita is a very significant first person narrator. Confessions of Max Kroll is a fantastic first person narrator. I mean, I think there's so many really I grew up on so many wonderful first person. Call Me Ishmael would be another one. I grew up on those, and my sense of what literature could do was really shaped by the brio and the kind of dazzle and the virtuosic quality of those often male first person narratives. And I just knew that wasn't the thing for me personally, at least not at this point in my writing career. It just wasn't something that I felt that I had access to. But I think I think at least for my first two books, I wrote very far away from my own experience, and I think I had this idea that you escape into fiction and you can be other than you are. And then of course, obviously the kind of terrible thing about writing fiction is you realize that it comes from you, and your imprint is all over the book, and it's not in that kind of tidy one-to-one of you're the central character and everything that happens in the novel has happened to you. But in a much more intimate way, the kind of structure of a book, the way, the kind of logic, the internal logic of the book, that's very much is when I read books by my friends, that's very much where I can see them reflected in the fiction. And I think once I realized that there is really no fiction that is not an act of exposure, then I also became much more, I would almost say, resigned to working in the first person.
And then Alex, I guess follow up to that for myself. Do you ever find you have those same difficulties writing the first person, or does it just come naturally to you?
I don't know. I started my first novel in the first person, and then the pressure of trying to make a first person voice that was totally distinct from that seemed like a lot. So this new book is in the third person. But I think there was a really interesting thing Katie said too about the way in which some first person narrators are hot and they're full of brio, right? And that brio affects you as a reader. But I feel like Katie's are, the distinction between hot media and cold media, like they're cool and chilly, and they ask the reader to warm them up and put themselves in there to make the feelings sort of leap off the page. And I think it's a really interesting version of a first person narrator that's also different from the ones I grew up reading that were often bombastic individuals I felt nothing like.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's really true. Like those, who I should say that, like, I learned the dazzle of fiction from those narratives in a lot of ways, but they're very much stepping very close to you. They're very kind of like, they're the people at the party who come stand very, very close to you. And I think that there's also like a way in which, you kind of want your reader to step towards you, if possible, to kind of come closer to you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. We have another question from Patty who says she loves your books and she says in Intimacies you write, quote, but I no longer believed the equanimity was either tenable or desirable, but at what internal cost? And she asks, what do you see as the internal cost of participating in the justice system?
Oh, wow. Patty, thank you so much for that question and for your kind words. It was interesting when I started researching this book. I interviewed a number of interpreters who worked at the International Criminal Court, which is a kind of model for the court in the novel, but is not itself the court in the novel. And I think I had a quite naive understanding of what interpretive work was, and I think I did foolishly think that it was almost like a mechanical act. And and they told me how they were very generous and very open, and they shared how difficult it was from a level of kind of somebody introduced me to this phrase vicarious trauma, which I found very useful in thinking about what is these characters are going through, both in terms of vicarious trauma, and they do have kind of help available that is made available to the interpreters if the kind of work becomes too taxing and too difficult for them. But something that they also brought up was there's a kind of ethical question that it opens up that is very difficult. So a story that really stayed with me, and I think probably very much informed this novel, was when an interpreter told me that he had been interpreting with somebody who had been accused of crimes against humanity, and he was doing close interpretation with this person. And when he was found innocent, even though he personally believed that he was guilty, when he was found innocent, he felt just flooded with relief, and he felt in that moment that he had somehow traveled very far from who he thought he actually was. And to me, that was such a case of how it's very hard. We are hard. I think we are a little bit hardwired to feel empathy for people, and that in this case, that was very troubling and very, very difficult for him. And so certainly I think that's, I don't think of the novel as a critique of the international criminal justice system, but I do think it's trying to think about the fact that it is an institution, and trying to think about how institutions function, and that there's a vast difference between the ideal of justice and then how justice necessarily has to be enacted on the ground. And I think, to some extent, I felt like these characters were kind of getting caught in that gap between, the ideal that they were, I think, trying to serve, and that they are serving, and then the kind of reality of that day-to-day experience, and how much it kind of was showing their kind of morals or their ethics to be more flexible than they wanted them to be or believed them to be, or that that we're capable of feeling these things, which is obviously troubling. So I hope that answers your question.
No, I think that answered that question very well. I'm just back to say, I think we're actually at the end of our evening here. I wanted to express my enormous gratitude to you, Katie, and to you, Alex, for this really brilliant conversation. Thanks to everyone out there who's spending their nights with us. Katie and Alex, did you have any last words before we close out?
I just want to say a huge thank you to you, Spencer, and to you, Alex. And I this was such a delight, and I want to encourage everybody to order Alex's book from Third Place Books at the handy links that have been dropped into the chat. But it is really an extraordinary book, and you will be just, it's a pleasure, and it's provocative, and it will make you think, but you will also just be in a state of joy. Also, Alex, your sentences are just, I mean, I was just at a writers' conference in Tennessee, but everybody was just saying, she's incapable of writing a boring sentence, and it's actually absolutely true. There's not a single sentence that is not just spectacular on the level of language and craft. So I encourage all of you. That's all I want to say. That's my big message.
You know how much I admire you. Bring it to blush. Really. Thank you so much, Spencer. This was a wonderful event, and I hope that everyone orders their books from Third Place.
Well, thank you. Yeah, seriously, go buy Intimacies and Something New Under the Sun over at thirdplacebooks.com. If you're local to the Seattle area, you can come see us at any one of our locations and come say hi. Other than that, on behalf of the bookstore, have a wonderful week and please be well, everyone.